Just before I get to that, I'm a coach myself, and I think it's really helps me as a researcher, and I hope it will help some of you understand this if it's new to you, to put it in a practical perspective. These are real-world examples of coaches at the very elite level using self-determination theory. I don't think they know anything about self-determination theory or know it exists, but through intuition and experience and just being smart coaches, some of the practices they're involved in mirror exactly what the self-determination theory people would recommend. So this is a quote, you're going to see a quote in a moment from this person who's Graham Henry, who was coach of the New Zealand All Blacks, which is the national rugby team in New Zealand. He took over in 2004. Since 2004, his team, the All Blacks, have won 84% of international matches. They have not won the World Cup, which is a source of frustration for us in New Zealand. But international sport, 84%. Now the All Blacks as a team in 120 years have a 75% win record. They have an amazing record. He's taken a team and made it perform even better. And one of the things he focuses on is this wonderful phrase, better people make better All Blacks. He believes he's coaching people, not rugby players. People who want to be better rugby players, and he believes that good people will be better rugby players into the bargain. This is a wonderful quote from him from a newspaper interview that he did. He knows nothing, as far as I know, about self-determination theory, but intuitive smarts have taught him this. This is Graham Henry, the coach, speaking. The players have a lot of input in what we're doing. We've empowered the players to voice their opinions so we can improve goal orientation. Players are happy when they are stimulated. When we talk about better people, we're talking about self-reliant, self-leadership, responsibility, that all sounds like autonomy, and collective ownership. That sounds like relatedness. So each of these three basic needs, Graham Henry, as a coach, works hard on to help the team satisfy. So it's not just a warm, fuzzy focus, it's actually a very practical focus. It helps the team win. 84% win rate in international rugby is a pretty impressive record. This stuff is not just warm, fuzzy, it works in a practical performance sense. Alright, I better get to these studies or I'm going to run out of time. First one is looking at intrinsic motivation. This is with one of my former honours students, Kylie Wilson, has since gone on and she did her PhD at the University of Wales in Bangor. And while she was there, she played international rugby for Wales and coached the Welsh women's rugby team and then worked at the University of Wales Institute of Cardiff. She's now back in New Zealand, I'm pleased to say, working for New Zealand Academy of Sport. But this was her honours thesis. It's an old study, but I think it's really interesting. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, the sport of rugby union only became professional in late 1995, and in New Zealand, 1996 was really our first year of professional rugby. So up until that point, these rugby players, they had extrinsic rewards, but they certainly were not paid. So rugby went professional, enormous increase in extrinsic rewards. Logically, you would expect, therefore, an increase in extrinsic motivation, because there are a lot of new rewards on offer. So that was the question. What did this massive increase in extrinsic rewards, did it hurt, did it increase extrinsic motivation, and did it potentially decrease intrinsic motivation? We use both of those two theories I've been talking about to examine that issue. So the pre-season of the 1997, the Super 12, it's now Super 15 rugby season. So this is the start of only the second year. Players have only had 1 year of being professional, so it's very new to them. So we had a sample of a professional rugby team in New Zealand. We compared them with some club or one level below that. In New Zealand, you know, as you can see, we use the sport motivation scale, the task, and the orientation sport questionnaire. So what we find, no significant difference between professional players and club players. No difference between intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation. So despite all this new import of extrinsic rewards, no impact yet, at least at this stage. Both groups were high in intrinsic motivation, as you can see, almost 5 on a 7-point scale, 7 being the highest. Both groups were moderate to high in extrinsic motivation, so it wasn't either or, they had bits of both. In terms of achievement goal theory, no differences either between professional and club players. Both groups were high in task and moderately high on ego, so it wasn't high task, low ego. This is a 5-point scale, you can see pretty high almost to the top on task and at the midpoint for ego. In terms of predicting intrinsic motivation, which was our main interest, if you followed the logic of those two theories, achievement goal theory and self-determination theory, you would expect that task orientation, because it's more focused on self, autonomy, competence, would predict intrinsic motivation, and in fact it did. And we explained 27% of the variance, which for psych variables is a pretty good chunk of variance. So, why wouldn't intrinsic motivation decrease despite all this extrinsic rewards? Well, self-determination theory explains this very nicely. If the rewards are perceived as informational, in 1996 there were 200,000 registered rugby players in the whole of New Zealand. And when the game went professional, only 125 people got paid to play. So if you're one of the chosen few, that's powerful information that you must be incredibly competent because you're one of the ones that's getting the contract. So that was our interpretation, that they perceived these extrinsic rewards as powerful information about my competence and my ability, which then feeds into my intrinsic motivation. Increase the level of perception of competence because I've earned this position, only 125 got there, I earned it, sense of autonomy. It'll be very interesting 10 years down the track, as we are now, or more in fact, whether or not that was still the case. I suspect it may not be. So the second study looks at achievement motivation and this idea of goal profiles. And this was done with a colleague of mine, Linda Petrichoff, from the United States. So we're interested in this idea of goal profiles, task and ego. Remember I said before, these are not bipolar, it's not an either or. The theory and the data is very clear in 20 years of research that they're orthogonal. You can be high in one, low in the other, high in both, moderate in both. But a lot of the research and the interpretation of the research before we did our study tended to portray them as task is good and ego is bad. When in fact the data wasn't saying that. It was almost like people wanted to be able to say that. We wanted to look at it in a bit more objective sense. So we had a sample of almost 250 odd club rugby players, a range of ages, but the means pretty experienced, 6 years, and we used the same achievement goal questionnaire. So what we find, 5-point scale again, this is the average for the whole group. So the mean again is quite high, almost 5's the top, remember, so very high in task, and reasonably high in ego, that point slightly higher. And then to get at this idea of a goal profile, we used a statistical procedure some of you may be familiar with called cluster analysis. What you do with cluster analysis is you try and find groupings within the data. Participants, or in this case rugby players, who are similar in terms of a motivational profile. Right? They grouped, clustered together is the idea. It's a very powerful data-driven way of finding groups within your data. And what we found? We found that the most adaptive profile in terms of predicting performance and enjoyment and self-esteem was this profile. People that were high in task, but also moderately high in ego. So compared to what a lot of other people had said in previous research, it wasn't high task good, low ego is the only thing that's good. We found no. Task is fine, ego is okay, as long as it's accompanied with high task. And we interpreted that to be that the strong characteristics of a task orientation can mask or buffer some of the potential negative implications of an ego orientation. So it's not an either or, it can be high in both. And if you've worked with elite athletes, you'll know that elite athletes are always high in ego. They want to win, of course they do. The more successful ones want to focus on this as much, if not more. So high task, high to moderate ego, we could, was the most adaptive one, not high task, low ego, as I've been saying, as a lot of people have perceived. High or high in both seems to be the most adaptive motivational focus for success in our experience. Third study. This is one of my master's students, Natasha McCarroll, a female rugby player. After she finished the study, she went to work with women's rugby in Hong Kong, and she's now a teacher in Hong Kong. So she came into my office, and I won't use the language she used, but she basically said, I'm very frustrated and annoyed with some of my teammates who won't train hard enough. I want to find out why. So I said, well, that sounds great, let's do a study. She used a bit more colourful language than that, but that was the gist of it. So we're interested in training motivation because clearly training is vital for success. And of course, most sports, and rugby is no exception, we spend far more time training than we do playing. And some of that training is far from thrilling or exciting like a game. It is good old-fashioned hard work, repetitive, monotonous, sometimes quite boring, but needs to be done in a required intensity to be effective. How do you motivate yourself to do that, particularly over an extended period of time? That was the question. So we looked at a professional rugby team. The length of a 4-month season as it was in 2000. This is the Super 12 team in those days, now Super 15. So again, 3 interviews, pre-season, mid-season, and just before the playoffs. So with the coach and the fitness trainer, we purposely chose 8 players who were identified by the fitness trainer as being the best trainers, the worst trainers, and the ones in the middle. So we have a range as defined by the fitness trainer. We had 8 individual case studies, and then cross-case, looking for similarities or common themes across, and that's what I'm going to report here. I don't have time to go through this in a lot of detail. If you've got questions, I'll be happy to talk about those later. So we found 6 major consistent themes. Some of these were positive in terms of influence training motivation. Some of them were negative in terms of influencing training motivation. So I'll define each of these briefly, and have some questions perhaps. So life skills, this is a descriptive label as is training ethic that we created, if you like, to try and characterise the information and knowledge that we had found here. So these are what's called first order themes from content analysis that came out of the interviews. So we call this life skills because they characterise, this is knowledge and skills beyond just training. The key organisational skill of the 2 best trainers in the team, they had the best time management, used the diary, a training log, and they also were both in part-time university study. They were busy people. They were organised people. The 2 worst trainers were doing nothing but playing rugby, were disorganised, spent most of the day on PlayStation, and didn't show up organised or focused for training. Very frustrating for the fitness trainer. So organisational skills is huge. And if your experience is line coaching, Generation Y are not very organised young people. Not a criticism on them. I think some of us have failed as parents and other things, but they need to be taught these skills as their experience. Training knowledge is a big one. I was just talking to one of the fitness trainers yesterday, and he uses the phrase training culture. Is that if you want players to train hard, they need to have knowledge and understand what it is that they're doing. So in layperson language, the fitness trainer needs to explain why physiologically is this program required. We do this because we'll get that outcome, and that outcome will lead to that sort of improvement in your performance on the field. The player needs to logically connect the dots. Why am I doing this? Because if they don't know why, or they don't believe that doing it will be effective and pay off, why would they be motivated to do it at the required level? Flip it around, if they do have that knowledge, they take responsibility, accountability for their training. Training ethic was the phrase we created here, but very motivationally orientated. Task mastery, what we found was the best trainers didn't treat training as a chore, they treated it as another way to compete. They're competitive, achievement-orientated people. They said training is another place to compete. I can compete against myself, improve my scores on fitness or speed tests, or I can compete against teammates or a training partner. They turned it into a game. We made it competitive to try and add to the enjoyment and satisfaction. So those 2 were the most powerful or influential of the 6 psych factors that influenced training motivation. Social support and social environment. 2 social things influenced by other people. Support was very direct, whereas environment was more indirect. So coach, manager, fitness trainer, medical support people directly supporting and encouraging people in their training. Training partners were hugely important here. A training buddy or partner to help push you and motivate you and compete against. And a powerful positive influence from a wife, girlfriend, children, significant others that matter to you. If they're positive and proactive about your training, flip it around. If they're negative and going, why are you going to train again? Why are you going, leaving the house at this time of the day, sort of thing. So those things can be very important. And the overall training environment or training culture, as one of the All Blacks fitness trainers was telling me yesterday, is hugely important. What are the expectations within the group of what good training is? And of course that is also connected to the overall team spirit culture that exists within the whole team.